Our first speaker is Elizabeth Hora-Cook, who reviews archaeological reports and site information for the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. Elizabeth is a professional archaeologist with research interests in the Fremont culture, and her paper is entitled Public Spaces and Private Places, the Construction of Social Landscapes in Jones Hole Canyon, Utah.
Hey everyone. Let's see. All right. Hi. Thank you guys for coming to this small prehistoric corner in this vast historic state history conference here, put on by the Utah Division of State History. So I'm Elizabeth Hora-Cook, and like Lee mentioned, I work at the State Historic Preservation Office in the Rio Grande downtown. Feel free to visit whenever you want. But before I was there, I was a lowly grad student, casting around for thesis projects and for inspiration more generally. And so this presentation grew out of one of those projects that inspired me. What I love about archaeology is thinking beyond the ruins that you see and the sprawling rock art that's out there, and thinking about the prehistoric people behind these things. So today I'm going to talk about what social meaning might be imbued in a landscape that we can walk through today. All around us we build private spaces, and then we come together in public places. And this was no different in prehistory. But before we get too far into that, let's set the scene a little bit. So where are we, when are we, and who are we talking about? So where are we? My research is focused in the Uinta Basin. It's a little bit dim, but you can see it, this dark area here. And specifically, I'm working right along the border in an area called Jones Hole Canyon. It's in Dinosaur National Monument. It's a beautiful place to hike and to fish. And it's always been beautiful all through prehistory. It's always had this spring-fed stream running north-south through it. Might be a little difficult. Awesome, thank you. And it drains into the Green River here. It's fairly easily accessible through this little canyon here. You can walk up and walk straight up north into Wyoming. Oops. Perfect. And so now let's talk about when we are in time and who it is that we're talking about. So I study the Fremont culture. Are you guys a little bit familiar with Fremont? A little bit. It's an archaeological culture. These people lived in the Uinta Basin and across what is generally now the state of Utah between about 400 AD and 1300 AD. They were a community of people who foraged for food and also farmed food. Similar to the ancestral Puebloan to the south, but interestingly, the Fremont really moved back and forth between these two modes of life. And here on the right, we've got a picture of a really famous rock shelter called Deluge Shelter. The sediments in there date back about 10,000 years, but we do see that closer up to the Fremont period, that 400 AD to 1300 AD, excavators found maize and grinding stones like manos and metates to process that maize. They also found things like amaranth and faunal bones. So people were incorporating both of these kinds of ways of life and both of these types of food into their diet. And then over here we have pilling figurines, really famous, found in, I want to say 9 Mile Canyon or Range Creek, somewhere in that Tabaputs area. And so really striking ideology. So all across the Fremont world, people were farming, foraging, living in different communities. Like the Uinta Fremont have a particular kind of way of life. The Sevier Fremont down closer towards like Cedar City have another one. But they're all tapped into this same sort of artistic expression that maybe is an ideological connection that they have. So backing out of thinking about the Fremont and thinking about landscape construction in general. Landscape construction, that's just sort of a fancy anthropological term for a phenomenon that we're all familiar with in this room. Landscapes have basically 3 different components to them, right? There's the natural component, the hills and the rivers, the plants and the animals that exist prior to any human intervention. And then within these landscapes, we create uniquely human spaces by building our environments. So what we have here is actually a picture of my adopted hometown, Midway, Utah, just to sort of demonstrate this a little bit. I took it just earlier this week, and the fall colors are really beautiful. So first, let's talk about the natural environment. This is a big valley with the Provo River running through it. It has hot springs, and then you can see there's quite a bit of elevation gain as you go up. I think that's Pine Canyon there. So this natural environment will structure some options for how people are going to use this space. Secondly, let's take a look at the built environment. Within this valley, we have homes and schools, churches, dentists' offices, grocery stores, soccer fields, everything that we find again and again across American towns. European Americans first moved into this valley in 1859, and they started building up their space to reflect the things that they wanted out of a space. Subsequent generations have appropriated these buildings for their own use and remodeled this valley for new purposes. Like here, we're looking at a golf course. That was not really a very 1859 kind of feature on the landscape. So what began as dirt roads, family farms, and irrigation ditches has grown into this suburban bedroom community for Provo and Salt Lake valleys. And so the last step in this landscape construction is imbuing this landscape with social meaning. This is something that we do every day without even really thinking about it. So when you walk into a completely new town, you already know how to behave in this space. You know that you can't walk into a family home uninvited, but you can walk into a grocery store and fill up your arms with anything and take off like a bandit with paying. So we have social norms about ownership that are at play in these physical spaces. If you walk into a church, you're going to interact with those people differently than if you were to walk into a dentist's office. So these spaces, this built environment that we've made, structures your membership into different groups and structures your interaction with other members of that same group. And so we all swim through these social spaces so gracefully that maybe we don't even notice. We don't realize our chameleon-like ability to blend into these new places. And so as an archaeologist, I'll never get to see how Fremont people blended through their spaces like that. All we have is these remnants of the built environment. So if you take Midway and take out the people, now you just have a bunch of different buildings with different kinds of characteristics. And so this is what I was thinking about a lot going through Jones Hole Canyon and in the months and years while I avoided my actual graduate work. So at the request of the Park Service, Judson, Finley, and I spent the summer recording archaeological sites in this canyon. And I had a great time. It was super fun. We spent a couple months out there with 2 undergraduates, and we really walked every inch of this canyon. We found some fascinating things, and things that I don't know if I'll ever see again as an archaeologist, things that I certainly hadn't found up to that point. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time touring you through this canyon and looking at the remnants of their social landscape. We're going to focus on 2 different sites of archaeological sites that the Fremont made out here. Rock art and granaries in particular. We found 30 sites in total. 16 of these sites had rock art. Only about 4 or 5 of them had granaries. So starting with rock art, out here what we tend to find is a style of rock art that we call the classic Bernal style Fremont rock art. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it is distinguished from, oh, I have a laser pointer. It's distinguished from other kinds of Fremont rock art by some pretty distinctive headgear, ear bobs. The Uinta Fremont really liked fancy dress. So here we've got a collar or a necklace and some sashes, and it looks like maybe a belt. He's also got a little headdress too, it's hard to see. We also have quite a bit of shooting damage, so someone shot him in the face. So the Uinta Fremont, like I was saying, they were tapped into the same sort of artistic and perhaps ideological expression as the rest of the Fremont world. But they were doing this in a particular way. They had their own style and their own flair to it. other kinds of rock art that we strongly suspect is Fremont, but that don't fall into the classic vernal style, we also found quite a bit in this canyon. This is from the Big Man panel, and I didn't include the Big Man because I really liked this procession. But the Big Man looks a little bit like him, but is big. So you can see that we still have the same humanoid figures. The Uinta Fremont creating this rock art really liked human figures. That's one of the most common types of elements or symbols that we find, followed by animals like deer, bighorn sheep, a couple of dogs. So we strongly suspect that this is Fremont, both in its subject matter and also in the sort of materials used to make it. Down here, this is from that very old site that I mentioned earlier, Deluge Shelter. In the Uinta Basin, in Jones Hole Canyon, it's a great place for fishing now, and it likely was a great place for fishing back in the Fremont time too, and people have interpreted this either as a snake or maybe a fishing net. Fishing nets are seen in a few different places throughout the Fremont world. This really could be a snake though. It's a little bit difficult to see. This looks very much like a tail of a snake. But so Fremont rock art, lots and lots of Fremont rock art. Outside of this Uinta style of Fremont rock art, we also find something that maybe is Barrier Canyon style like. So I'll start with, he's a little hard to see over here, possibly Fremont style. A little easier to see drawn out here, right? We've got a necklace that's pecked in, we've got a headdress, a really interesting headdress, a sash, all very classic vernal style. And then next to them, in these drip lines, we have these tall, lanky, ghost-like figures in red ochre. That's more characteristic of what we call a Barrier Canyon style. And that's found much further to the south. Sort of centered around Grand County, San Juan County, and then travels up through the Tavaputs Plateau a little, or the Tavaputs, West Tavaputs Plateau a little bit. So, again, we're seeing possibly a communication of people, at the very least ideas, about artistic expression. So switching then from all of these rock art sites, 16 sites with rock art, to granaries, many fewer of them. We were able to find 4, but reportedly there were 5 out there. One was perhaps misplotted, so that's out there for someone else to rediscover someday. But this is a really cool granary. It was made inside of a big rock alcove here, and you can sort of see the remnants of a wall. And so this was built with tabular sandstone stacked up in several different courses, probably all the way to the ceiling, and reinforced with mud daub or hakal. You can also see that they had some structural element to it made out of sticks and twigs. Right here we have a stick, and it's maybe a little hard to see, but they've actually tied twine around here. It's very exciting to find that, and so we dated that. We used radiocarbon dating, and we got a date of about 10,000 AD on, 1000 AD on that, sorry. Up here, also difficult to see, but we have juniper scraps. Possibly the remains of a juniper mat that was laid down here, or something else, but it looks like it was laid in there intentionally. It doesn't look like that's a part of a pack rat midden or anything. It actually comes from sort of in the center. So really big granary space. This is my favorite granary out here because it's just such a classic shape. It's falling down a little bit now, but you can see that it's under this overhang right here, and that's kind of sheltered it from the elements a little bit. It would have stood about yay high and been a little bit beehive shaped. They would have stacked that tabular sandstone that's just everywhere, and again, daubed it up. You can see the roof of it. These are actually shaped daub loaves. So they would pack mud, pack cacao with some sticks in there. Got a pretty sweet stick. and lay those on top. And then they would take another piece of thinner sandstone and chip it down, shape the sides of it, and place it on top so that vermin couldn't get in. I pointed out this stick because it was really important. We pulled that out of the daub to sample it because we know that this stick comes from about the same time that that daub was made. So that came from, I want to say, 900 AD, so just about a century before that other granary was built. The last granary that I'm going to show you is the most unique granary that I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like this. So the Fremont took it, well, we believe it's the Fremont for a couple of reasons, but they took advantage of this interesting natural feature. You can see here on the right that we have a rock overhang, and inside it there's a bunch of mud. There was an alluvial event or something that for years and years washed mud in there and laminated it up and up and up, and then down-cutted right like from the drip line. So water now is rushing off of that slick rock sandstone and just washing out the rest of it, and leaves this nice kind of knee-high shelf in this rock overhang, into which people excavated down perfect circles. Perfect circles. We had about 4 of them in here. And you can see there's some sticks inside it, kind of shoring it up a little bit. It's a little bit of this like nice oxidated area here, and the kicker is that Hakal slab. And it looks just like the tops of this last one here. See? And so that's a pretty Fremont characteristic, which is why we're fairly sure that this is Fremont in date, but we didn't take a radiocarbon date from this, so that's not really, that's not super certain for us. But it's such a cool site. I'm very excited to find it. So swinging back around then to this idea of the construction of public spaces and private places. So I'm going really broad here. What spaces are public? What spaces are private? What kinds of spaces should everyone have access to? And what kinds of spaces should maybe only be open to members of certain select groups of people? My idea is that rock art might denote public spaces. It's big and bold, and it sort of trades in the same elements and styles and motifs as were spread across the Fremont world. So I'm thinking that rock art should be located in public spaces. On the flip side of that coin, granaries should be more private spaces. These shouldn't be operating like food banks where anyone could pick up and drop off food on a whim. Food was a privately owned commodity in Fremont society. Not exactly like today, but you could think of it as similar today. Just like you wouldn't walk into a stranger's house and raid their fridge, because that's pretty socially uncool. Neither would Fremont people. That's theft. So what I was thinking, is that rock art should be located along travel corridors where anyone can see it. And granaries should be located farther away from these travel corridors where maybe people wouldn't ordinarily go. And let me just break this one down a little bit because it's a little difficult to understand right off the bat. So Jones Hole Canyon, again, is this north-south trending canyon flooding into the Green River. The Green River is not really a great outlet because it is just a sheer rock wall canyon and a very fast-flowing river right here. So the main inlet and outlets are to the east-west. That goes to a place called Island Park in Dinosaur National Monument, or straight north to a place called the Diamond Plateau that borders Wyoming and goes up into the Uinta Mountains. So rock art, I took the mean areas of where rock art and granaries were found across the landscape. So we find them, I'm forgetting to use this and I am too short not to. So we tend to find rock art all along this canyon here, but it's really centered right here, just at the confluence of where Jones Creek and Ely Creek meet. So rock art does seem to fall along this travel corridor. Also, this bigger green circle is denoting the one standard deviation of rock art distance from this mean. So although rock art is found all along that red line, it's centered there, and you're most likely to find the most rock art right in here, somewhere right in there. So rock art is not only falling really close to this travel line, but rock art is all in one place. There's one-stop shopping to get your ideological fix, your artistic fix, which is, again, I'm just going to plug Jones Hole Canyon. It's great for hiking because you see a lot of rock art. It's all right along the travel corridor. Granaries, on the other hand, seem to be much further back. Their means are really not even overlapping here. Granaries are in a significantly different location. They're further back, and you can't really see it from here, but the way that this Ely Creek area comes out, it spreads to the east, to the west, from Jones Hole Canyon, and each little side canyon just kind of fingers out into an area called the Labyrinths. And so each one of these side canyons is a box canyon. There's really only one way in and one way out, and that's up Ely Creek. So access is really restricted. Also, I'm just going to scoot back a couple here. This granary, Ely Creek Granary number 3, you can see it's on a sandstone ledge. The only way to access that sandstone ledge is by starting your walk about a quarter mile to the south. So if you didn't know that access point, you're really not getting to this granary. If you were walking along the valley bottom below and you looked up and saw it, you'd have a hard time. It would take you a little while to figure out what your access point is. So these granaries really are somewhat hidden back there. Their access is more restricted. They're also more geographically spread out. So this red circle represents one standard deviation from the mean again. So most granaries fall within this circle. This is the very center of it. This is where your average granary would be found. There's no granary in that location, but so most granaries are found within this big spread out area. So if you're walking through the canyon, you're going to see rock art because it's right along the path, and you're going to see rock art a lot within this one corridor. What you're not going to see is granaries. And if you do see a granary, you're going to just see them one at a time, and you're going to have to target your way up there. So it does seem then like that might be a Fremont social construction of space. Rock art sites do seem like they are clustering around these travel corridors, and granary sites are much more difficult to see. This is a better, I think, drawing of, you can see the difference in relief here, right? This is what I mean by travel corridors. Like, look at how crazy steep this thing is. Jones Hole Canyon is really funneling people through in one direction. And all along that direction, the Fremont decided, this is where we're putting our rock art. This is where we're communicating with people who maybe aren't within our social group, as in maybe they're not our direct family members, but maybe they're within our larger social group and are tapping into the same artistic and perhaps ideological trends and themes that we also get. So rock art, big and bold and all over the place. Granaries, this is a little granary. Someone excavated it a long time ago. It used to have a wall in front of it, which would make it more clear, but this thing was hard to get to. You had to walk up a really long sandstone ledge and then like make a sharp left. At one point the sandstone ledge got really dicey. So, I mean, that, even though it's visible, even though you can see that from a long ways away, it really has a restricted access. And so that restricted access really says to me that this was off limits to but a certain select few people. And so maybe this doesn't seem like much because it's just public and private space. It's just a really vast dichotomy, and that's one way of looking at the world, but we can do better. It might not seem like much, but it's a start. So by determining what areas were more or less accessible to the masses, we might be starting to figure out how the Fremont imbued this landscape with social meaning. This way of thinking about social landscapes with divided private and public spaces might also work for other regions of the Fremont world. At the very least, it can give us something a little bit interesting to think about on these nice autumn hikes that we have available now. And so with that, that is what I have for you today. Thank you so much for coming. I also have a few other people to thank. Dinosaur National Monument for letting us do all this work here. Judson's here. Thank you for letting me do this work with you. And Wayne Prokopets. Utah State University was a massive help for the obvious reasons of graduate school, and our great undergraduate assistants, Rebecca Heidenreich and Jason Bruff. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Judson Finley. He's assistant professor in anthropology in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Utah State University. Dr. Finley is an archaeologist whose interdisciplinary geological and paleoecological research examines the intersection of culture and nature in the Central Rocky Mountains, Eastern Great Basin, and Northern Colorado Plateau. His paper is entitled The Fremont Archaeology of Dinosaur National Monument, 50 Years After Breternitz.
Well, thank you everybody for coming today. If you'll give me just a second to figure out what my reality is here.
We're all worked out.
It's shifting constantly. Okay. Change slides from the computer itself or from the clicker? Okay. So I wanted to just take a few minutes to just kind of give you guys a little bit of my background. And so I started at Utah State University in 2012, and in a lot of ways, coming back to Utah was a really important moment for me. And I grew up in the West, mostly in Wyoming, but I was actually born in Salt Lake City, and so I have a lot of connections in the valley, a lot of family in the valley. My grandparents came, or my great-grandparents came to Salt Lake in 1905, and my great-grandfather was an Italian immigrant, and one of his first efforts to farm was in Billings, Montana, and he was really interested in growing celery, and I'm not really sure why that was, but obviously growing celery in Billings, if any of you guys know that area, just wasn't going to work. And so word of mouth brought him down here to Salt Lake, and he ended up with 5 acres out here in West Valley, not too far from where we're at now, in 1905. Was here with his brother, and then about 6 years later, had a mail order bride shipped from which is very bizarre to me to kind of look at our family records, but literally like wrote letters to his family village in Italy, and my great-grandma Anna came over, and my grandfather was born here in 1922. So over the course of a few years, my great-grandfather accumulated what became a 30-acre farm right here in the middle of West Valley, and that was a place that I knew growing up. My grandparents lived just a couple of blocks from here. My dad grew up a couple of blocks from here. My dad became, along with my grandpa, a structural steel worker and hung steel for the ZCMI high-rise and the church office buildings. So we talk a lot about place, particularly on these history meetings, and the role of place, and it means a lot to all of us in different ways, right? But when we come into a place like Salt Lake, place resonates with us in so many different ways, okay? And our connection with archaeology is much the same, because what we do as archaeologists is we get out there and we get to learn the landscape, hopefully, ideally, in a way that Native people experienced it at some moment in the past, okay? Now, I also wanted to take this opportunity at this meeting to reflect on the work and early career of Dave Breternitz. And what you see here is a photo of Dave. This is from his obituary in 2012. He was an archaeologist at the University of Colorado that back in the late 50s and early 1960s was doing a lot of work for the National Park Service, and ended up, he did a lot of work at Dinosaur, which is what I'm going to talk about today, ended up at Mesa Verde and really kind of cracked the book on Mesa Verde. And he had his kid, Corey, with him most of the time, and his wife and his daughter, Susan, as well. Pretty much well grew up on most of the sites that he worked on. And Corey grew up to become an archaeologist and runs a company out of Phoenix, Arizona, and lives in Dolores, Colorado now. So on the left is a young Corey Del Breternitz. I've struck up some conversations with Corey, and he's full of information. And really, depending on where you want to start history, I would consider this to be the history of archaeology. So a lot of times what we do is go back and revisit old archaeological sites. And that's what I want to show you guys today, is some of this work. So I grew up mostly in Wyoming. I've done most of my research in Wyoming, and most of that work has kind of centered on the Bighorn Basin area, up here in the Bighorn Mountains and the Yellowstone Plateau. You see highlighted here, I've highlighted two of my big projects area. This is Bighorn Canyon, and this is Dinosaur National Monument. So when I came to Utah State in 2012, I was wrapping up about 8 years worth of work here at Bighorn Canyon. I really wanted to start a new project area, and I really wanted to work at Dinosaur. And I kept thinking to myself, how am I going to get to Dinosaur? And I wanted to kind of explore this Fremont archaeology because it's a really important archaeological record. And it just so happened that at the end of my first year at Utah State University, I got an email from, it was forwarded to me from Wayne Prokopets, who was the Chief of Cultural Resources at the park at that point in time, looking for somebody to work in Jones Hole. And I said, pick me. And he said, I'll pick you. And so I went out in the summer of 2013, met with Wayne, and we got ready to start this project. And what I wanted to show you is just really quickly, I feel like I've been sort of blessed in the places that I get to work because I get really good canyon country, and it's really, really beautiful. So if you've never been to Bighorn Canyon up on the Wyoming-Montana border, I highly recommend it. And before I move on, I want to just kind of poll the room really quickly. How many of you guys have actually been to Dinosaur? Most of us here, right? I started going to Dinosaur when I was a little kid. You know, I remember standing in front of that bone wall going, holy cow, right? Seeing rock art and really just, you know, kind of had some images in my mind of what that was like. But it had been, probably a good 25, if not 30 years since I had actually been in Dinosaur National Monument. Now, how many of you guys have been into Jones Hole? You gotta work for Jones Hole a little bit. You gotta walk down in there. It's a couple miles. It's an easy walk, and I highly recommend it because it's really, really beautiful, and you get to see a lot of things. Okay, so of course we think of Dinosaur National Monument. We think of dinosaurs, but there's also a really, really spectacular archaeological record. Most of us see and experience that archaeological record as rock art, but there's really much more out in this area, okay? And that is kind of, you know, what I'm trying to do as a professor at Utah State University with my students, both graduates and undergraduates. I'm not a rock art specialist, and I'm not here to give you a talk about rock art, okay? I am really new in the archaeological record of the Fremont world, right? So there are people who have dedicated their careers to trying to understand what Fremont really is, and I consider myself to be a novice, okay? So I'm building a lot on the work of other people, and particularly I rely a lot on the theoretical models of Steve Sims and Dave Madsen, who've spent a lot of time thinking about what Fremont means, okay? So let's just explore that really quickly. Elizabeth gave us a little bit of background in what Fremont is. So here, basically Fremont is kind of thought to cover most of Utah, north of the Colorado River. So it's really northern Colorado Plateau, eastern Great Basin. If I could redraw this line, I'd show up much more over here in western Colorado and then up into southwestern Wyoming as well, but that works really good for right there. How do we conceptualize Fremont? Okay, and that's really one of the big questions. And I'm gonna paint in broad brushstrokes. Okay, so we think of Fremont as being forager farmers, all right? They're multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic groups of people who essentially all bought into the idea of growing corn, all right, in what otherwise might be a very difficult place to grow corn, especially as we get further north up here, all right? Now, it's a continuum. Fremont is a continuum between people who lived as full-time foragers and full-time farmers. And people over the course of their life might move back and forth between being a full-time farmer and a full-time forager, or they might be committed to one lifestyle strategy over another, okay? As Elizabeth mentioned, there's some common ideologies that are expressed across the Fremont world that's really remarked in figurines, rock art, although there's a lot of regional variation in rock art. We talk about pit house villages or pit house hamlets, and other kinds of diagnostic artifacts like pottery and things like that. And what we've seen from some of the material records where they've been preserved is a really elaborate material culture, which is what we come to expect of most people, period, right? So what I'm showing you here is a flicker feather headdress from Mantle's Cave in Colorado. And when you see some of the rock art images that have these kind of forked headdresses, some people interpret those as being similar to these flicker feather headdresses. Okay, so I wanted to, again, just kind of reflect back on the archaeology that Dave Breternitz did in the 1960s. And this was mostly done in 1963 and 1964 with University of Colorado undergraduate students and a couple of graduate students. This was a training ground for what was going to become some pretty big thinkers in archaeology. This is a young Brian Hayden right here who went on to study complex societies in the Colorado or the Columbia Plateau. What we're looking at right here is a slide of the profile of Deluge Shelter down in Jones Hole Canyon, named because they got nailed by a really major flash flood while they were in the middle of the excavations. Oops. Went the wrong way. I'll drive from here. So they had the privilege of camping out here at Josie's cabin, for those of you guys that have been to Josie's. And in fact, one of the first things I learned from Corey was that Josie was alive when they were out there, and then she passed away. And Dave and Barbara, who was his wife, spent a year with Corey and Susan in Josie's cabin. So they were probably the last people to live in that little log cabin with a dirt floor and pretty poor windows, which I think is, again, just kind of all parts of that interesting fabric. Dave likes to use Corey for scale. This to me is really interesting, right, because we can go back to some of these photos from 1963 and look at this panel. How many of you guys have ever seen this panel before? It's out at McKee Springs, for those of you that have been out in that area. And then the other thing that I see, of course, that just always gets my attention is when you have people standing in front of these big blocks of sediment like this, these big stratigraphic profiles, I think to myself, boy, that's a lot of archaeology right there. This is Thorne Cave, which is located just outside of Judson on your way into the park. And it's not actually on the park, excavated by Harold Day at the University of Utah at the same time that that Dave was out in Dinosaur. Okay, so I'm going to come back. I want you guys to remember this profile because I'm going to try to highlight something specifically from that deposit. Now, we've been working here in Jones Hole and Cub Creek. There are other really major Fremont landscapes in Dinosaur National Monument. We could include McKee Springs out in, I think it's out in this area. And I know much less about that. In fact, I think there needs to be a lot of survey done out there because in my experience, wherever there's a constellation of rock art, there should be some villages as well, okay? But I'm going to focus on Jones Hole and Cub Creek. And I just kind of wanted to give you guys a sense of what those two different archaeological records look like and what I think they mean, okay? What we're learning from them. Before we move forward, I wanted to also highlight why we're out there in the first place, okay? And part of that is what I do is work in assistance with the National Park Service. So I work with Lisa Baldwin, who's here with us today, to help locate sites, update site records, and then ultimately what we've been doing is preparing National Register of Historic Places nominations for many of these landscapes. Some of these sites haven't been visited for 50 years, right? And I'll show you what some of those records look like. Some of these sites, like this one right here, are really prominent in the interpretation at Cub Creek, and we have very few records for them, right? And so we've got to work to change that. And then also along the way, sometimes we encounter things like a looter screen tucked underneath a cliff right here, right? So some of these sites are still being impacted by illegal excavations. All right, so we can just ask a really fundamental question. What's the status of the records? What's the status of the sites, right? So we're performing really just kind of primary records keeping and condition assessments. And this becomes really important because there's a lot of visitors that go into this area, okay? So during our time in Jones Hole, we estimated, and we were there for about 6 weeks, we estimated somewhere on average of 100 to 120 people per day in Jones Hole. Those are coming up from the river camps at the confluence of Jones Creek and the Green River, and also down from the fish hatchery at Jones Hole itself. Out in Cub Creek, I couldn't even begin to say it. I guess maybe greater than 300 people are out there per day. But the visitation is really, really high, all right? And so we have to ask the question, what is the impact of visitation on the archaeological record? And we perform a really kind of vital service in helping to maintain that. You're going to see some redundancy between images that I show you and the ones that Elizabeth showed you. And hopefully what that will mean to you is that these are things that both Elizabeth and I think are really important. We did not talk about what images we were gonna show, but I wanted to give you a sense of what some of the paperwork looks like when we start out. Now, first of all, what you need to see is that this record dates to 1947, and it was never updated after 1947. It's a cave, southwest exposure, Ely Creek, and the notes are this is the only area that has evidence of structures and human remains, right? So when I see that, I'm like, what does that mean? You know, that could be artifacts, or it could be human skeletal remains. I don't know, but we have to figure that out, okay? So we find ourselves out in these landscapes pretty much while just wandering around trying to find things without much of a knowledge of where these sites are at all. This is looking back down the canyon. So to get up in here, you've got to kind of scramble your way up through a bunch of rocks, and you find a little opening that's facing up valley right here. All right. Elizabeth showed you guys these photos. I came into this site one day. I saw this and I was thinking to myself, yep, I've seen rock shelters like this hundreds of times. And then I saw, leaning up against this rock over here, this pile of mud adobe or jacal, right? And you can see the horizontal grooves in there. And those are stick impressions, right? So I saw that and I was like, whoa, that's like a granary. And I've never seen a granary in my life, and it was really cool, right? I'm not the first person to see this granary. I won't be the last. It's way off the beaten path, but people, you know, have been out to this area. Now, just to connect you to the human face of that granary, right? These are fingerprints in the back of the mud, and those are 1,000-year-old fingerprints. So that's what we get to see as archaeologists, right? Further back in there, and Elizabeth showed you what we identified as a wild clematis vine that had been used to tie some sticks together. A knot, right? A 1,000-year-old knot. It seems really simple, but those are the kinds of things that really make us think, okay? We monitor erosion. These footpaths that go in a lot of these areas become natural water courses. We've seen just over the last couple years in a series of major flash floods, These things down cut, sometimes a foot and a half in a single event. They'll expose archaeological deposits. Very ancient wood is being exposed in the bottoms of these arroyos. So this tree was growing in the bottom of this arroyo before it filled up with sediments, and it's now being exposed again. I would estimate this tree is probably maybe 3,000 years old, all right? But we could date that and figure that out. Okay, so let me just give you a quick summary of what we think we know, all right? I should have said what we think we know because we never really know anything, but what this really means. And I'm going to approach it not necessarily chronologically, but as I've experienced these two areas, okay? And they're very, very different from each other. So, first of all, what were people doing in Jones Hole? And Elizabeth talked a little bit about that. This is just a Google Earth image, and it shows these slick rock exposures that are known as the labyrinths, okay? People were living mostly in rock shelters, and the major rock shelters are all highlighted in red. And as Elizabeth noted, there are granaries, and most of those granaries are tucked away in high rims and out-of-the-way places, okay? So they were not meant to be found except by the people who knew that they were there, okay? Now, this really, if we think about this as a farming environment, right? You have very limited arable ground. Jones Hole itself probably is not that good because Jones Hole is a very high energy stream, and it just washes all that good sandy alluvium out of there. Now, up here you get into Ely Creek and Big Draw, and these are all really big, thick, sandy floodplains. And I think that those Fremont farmers really liked those areas because water can only run off of that slick rock, right? So it rains, it snows, water goes off and recharges those floodplains, and that's where people would farm. Okay, so there's springs in these floods, in these areas, and you could basically dry farm very easily. Now, you wouldn't necessarily want to be here in the wintertime, okay? So what I think is that these fields are supplying other communities that are maybe out here in the Island Park area, okay? So you grow your crops, spend your summer out here in Jones Hole, hunting up in the high country. When you finish growing your crop, you stash it in granaries, and periodically you send probably strapping young dudes back up here with baskets to carry baskets full of corn back to the village, okay? Let me add that most of the archaeological record that we've dated from here, probably around 8 sites, mostly dates between AD 1000 and 1300. Okay, there's a little bit on the leading edge of that, but most of that seems to concentrate right around that area. Okay, now contrast that with Cub Creek, and this is, again, I've only spent one field season out in Cub Creek. That was this summer, and so this is really new to me. Everything in red is what constitutes what I call a pit house hamlet. All right, so this has been known for a long time as the Cub Creek Village or the Cub Creek Villages. And what I want you guys to think about is that each one of these red concentrations is maybe anywhere from 1 to 20 house pits. All right, they weren't all occupied at the same time, but think about this rather than each one of these being a village. Think about this as one big village. All right, so red is pit houses, blue is rock art sites, and this is not all of the rock art sites either. Okay, I wanted to give you a sense of what those house pits look like. Okay, so here's a photograph from Dave's work in 1963 at a place called Wagon Run. These house pits are about anywhere from 3 to 5 meters in diameter. What you see here in the center is what's known as an Adobe rimmed fire pit. Okay, so they're basically making this Hakal or Adobe, lining their fire pits, but they're also using lots of storage pits, subfloor storage pits. All right, what you don't see is the granaries like we see at Jones Hole. Okay, a lot of rock art, and I would call a lot of this rock art the big man imagery, right? So we see a lot of these, these images of these really, really well decorated people, and I think that that's reflecting some kind of social organization in this valley. All right, and that's a whole different topic. All right, so people were growing a lot of corn all here in the floodplain. Again, it's all being charged by this slick rock coming off of Split Mountain right here. All of these canyons are spring-fed. There's springs coming out of the head. Cub Creek itself runs year-round. So this would have been a really, really good place to farm. Okay. Now I just want to show you a discovery that we made, and of course we're not the first to see this, but we went up looking for what we thought was going to be a granary, what we had told was a granary. I could see this rock shelter, not this one, so I put this in here just because it's just a little pocket, all right? But there was a big rock shelter. I thought, well, let's go up and take a look at that. We went in, there was nothing there. The photographer I was working with turned around and saw that. And we were like, whoa, how cool is that? And of course, I want to know what that thing dates to. And what I've learned is that we want to really try to identify stems or twigs, what we call short-lived annuals in the mud, rather than working with the larger wood. And there you have it right there, okay? And we just got the date back on that. And it's AD 1070 plus or minus 60 years, okay? Now what I want to tell you guys is that all of those pit houses that have been radiocarbon dated, and there's about 6 of them, date from 500 to 800 years ago, okay? We don't see much that dates in this time period, and so I'm not surprised at all to see a granary that looks like people are stashing corn to come back for later on that dates to this time period, okay? So what I want to leave you guys with is just some real basic thoughts on how we can connect climate and culture during this time period, okay? We have, and one of the things that Elizabeth has been working on is using tree rings to reconstruct climate. And one of the reasons that we're interested in that, of course, is that we get annually resolved records beginning from the year that we collect them and as far back as we can push that record. And what we see right here is a tree ring record that's a 2,000-year record from the Tavaputs Plateau, and it's the only record of this length for this part of the northern Colorado Plateau, and we need to replicate it. And what you see, so this black line right through here is the historic mean, all right? And the solid line that you see moving up and down is variations about that historical mean, okay? And what I want to point you guys, or key you in on, are a series of major droughts right in here, 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 and here. And I would consider these 2 droughts to basically be about the same. And then a couple of wetter intervals, okay? Now, here's the argument I want to make to you, and this is what I want to leave you with, okay? Farming is not the best decision in the world, right? If you're a forager, it means that you have to settle down and live on the landscape. Now, that might seem like a pretty good idea to you, but it's actually really risky, okay? So people, what we know from theoretical studies and ethnographic studies is that people will typically only farm corn when other food resources on the landscape become really scarce, right? So this gives us a really interesting window into thinking about the origins of agriculture in our global civilization, right? Because that's a major turning point for our society. Now, in the Fremont world, that starts right about here, right about AD 400 is when we see the first evidence of farming in the northern Uinta Basin, all right? So I think we can make an argument that people chose to start farming corn right about this time. They had knowledge of corn because they were interacting with basket makers and ancestral Puebloan people further off to the south. They had knowledge of corn, and they settled down, all right? And in this window right here is Cub Creek. And they settled down and they started to form these villages pretty quickly. Now, what I wanted to point out to you guys, another site that we saw this summer, we came around the corner and just looking for some rock art, and this is all the way up on the eastern end of Cub Creek, and I saw this, and I was like, well, what the heck is that? And as I got up to it, it's a big column of sediment, and what you can see is that that sediment continues all the way across this way, and there's some little pockets of sediment up in here. Now, the real trick is that the bottom of the drainage is about 20 meters below that, okay? And there's Fremont rock art all along the top of this sediment package. So I think that this was the level of the valley fill about that time period, AD, let's call it 500 to 700, when there was a lot of people in Cub Creek, all right? So decrease moisture, as we see here in the tree ring record, and Cub Creek is not going to be able to carry its sediment load, right? And that floodplain is going to grow and grow and grow. Whatever water is still coming gets channeled off of that slick rock down into the valley. Farming is still good because temperatures are warmer, right? So you have more frost-free days. So this is a period of what Madsen and Sims would call intensification, all right? Behavioral modification, where foragers decide to take on this experiment of farming. That goes pretty well for a while, and then something happened. And I'm thinking that maybe right in this window here, or this window here, when precipitation increased, this cut down through it, right? So Cub Creek started to flow more water, cut down into its channel, and people couldn't grow corn very easily there anymore, right? So then we have to shift strategies. People move up to places like Jones Hole here, where they're growing corn out in more marginal areas, storing it and bringing it back to village sites, okay? So that's some of the things that we're thinking about and we're learning in Cub Creek and Jones Hole in Dinosaur, and this will go on for several years, okay? Tree ring research, geoarchaeology, redating many of these features, going back through the collections, doing all of this kind of work that needs to be done because it's been sitting in archives for 50 years. So, so with that, I'm on the beginning of what I hope to be a great adventure. And I have a lot of people that carry me along the way, and most importantly right now is Lisa. Jim Bradford and Andrew Veach from the National Park Service helped me get the project in place in the interim between when Wayne Prokopetz left and Lisa Baldwin showed up, and they're great supporters of mine. Andrew McAllister is my photographer. Justin DeRose is a master dendrochronologist. And then, of course, my graduate students, Elizabeth Hora-Cook and Richard Olson. Let me tell you something. Professors, we learn everything we know from our graduate students. So I couldn't do this without them. So so that's what I have. Thank you.
Okay, we'll begin our question and answer session. Elizabeth, would you come up? Sure, Rend. Do we have any questions for speakers?
I have one about the radiocarbon dating.
Yeah.
The ones that you took in the call.
Uh-huh.
How did you deal with contamination?
Well, so just generally speaking, right, in the process of radiocarbon dating, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but those samples will go through a lot of pretreatments in the lab, and to remove any potential contaminants. We never handle samples, so I'll extract them either with a knife, a scalpel, or a pair of tweezers. They go straight into tin foil, inside of a bag, and then off to the lab. So I never handle things. I'm making an assumption about dating that targeting short-lived annuals like a twig, a stem, a piece of grass is going to more closely approximate the age that the feature was constructed than maybe using the structural wood that could have been laying on the landscape for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we try to reduce our sources of uncertainty, contamination being one of them. But you know, those short-lived annuals could have been laying there in the mud for hundreds of years too. So, but everything that we've dated so far using short-lived annuals has been, I think, a pretty good date. I've been pretty satisfied with it.
Is there another question? Go ahead.
Any theories on where the Fremont culture came from and where they went?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can give you other people's ideas and my own thoughts. Okay, so what Steve Sims and Dave Madsen have said, and I've heard Steve say this a lot, is that we have to think about the Fremont as being essentially a migrant population from the south, which is largely basket makers, so ancestral to even the Puebloan people, the people who had that idea of agriculture, right? Because essentially the pit houses look, for all intents and purposes, like southern Colorado Plateau pit houses. So northern migrants interacting with a native foraging base, right? So native population. So there's some intermixing of populations. That's probably where they came from. And where they went is a really, really good question. In my opinion, they're probably ancestral Ute. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with what's called the Nunnik expansion hypothesis, but I don't buy that. So I think that people continued to farm in Jones Hole maybe up into the 1300s and 1400s. We're starting to see evidence of irrigation, what we thought was going to be Fremont irrigation. Again, this is Steve Sims' work. That looks to be protohistoric or historic in age. So there may have been some isolated native communities that were still farming and growing corn in the 1500s and 1600s. So again, I think that they just shifted strategies. So, but that's an opinion.
For either one of you, do we know what sort of populations there were in some of these villages and communities that started to form? And was there a peak and a low point of how these people, I mean, did they live largely as communities, or did they live pretty independent, kind of nomadic lives? Or
it's a very good question. Do you want to try to take that, or do you want me to steal your knowledge?
Yeah, go ahead and steal it. You've got that.
So,
probability distribution.
okay, so estimating populations, we don't need to necessarily show it. Yeah. So estimating populations is really difficult, for one thing, from an archaeological perspective. So we can use house size and make arguments about how many people might live in a house based on ethnographic data and number of houses. But then we can never be absolutely certain how many houses were occupied simultaneously, right? So whenever we talk about populations, we have to just think in terms of more than or less than, right? And what Elizabeth is doing right now for her thesis, and I think it's going to be really fascinating when it comes down to it, we're starting to use these kind of pooled data sets of radiocarbon ages as a proxy for population. And the basic idea is that more people on the landscape will leave more evidence of their remains. We should have more radiocarbon dates for that particular time period. So we can begin to model populations based on radiocarbon data. And this is being done a lot, particularly recently, looking at farming populations, so what we would call the Neolithic Transition, in the Old World and in the interior Western North America. And there's really remarkable trends in what happens with population when people pick up maize agriculture, whether it's 12,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, right? What we can see from what Elizabeth is doing is that it looks like there was a pretty sudden increase in population in that 500 to 700 AD window, right? Now, my sense is that in the northern Uinta Basin, this translates into a period of time when people were living more in pit house hamlets or villages, right? There seems to be a little bit of a lull between about 700 or 800 and about 1,000 years ago, and then it picks back up again during what we would call the medieval climate anomaly. But it appears to be a very different form. So it looks to me like a much more dispersed population. So maybe not necessarily a shift in the overall numbers of people on the landscape, but a shift in how they were living. So they're spread out in more places, which maybe meant that they were relying more on these isolated agricultural areas like Jones Hole. Okay, does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it also brings
There-
up a whole bunch of more questions.
Totally. There are trends through time, right? But they do seem to be pretty clear, and I think it's pretty exciting. So.
Elizabeth, I have a question for you regarding rock art distributions. Rock art, especially the big anthropomorphs, require an expansive, pretty flat rock for the creation. And so I'm wondering if the geology might not be constraining the distribution of at least some kinds of rock art.
Yeah, absolutely. The availability of space, the right kind of rock, absolutely does. We tend to see a lot of this rock art on sandstone because sandstone is soft enough to get a rock in there. I mean, people were using stone tools. So think about, if you've got something stronger than sandstone, like basalt or some other sort of granite, that's going to carve really nicely in there. So you're going to want a sandstone package. And then it's even better if that sandstone changes color when it's exposed to the wind and air and elements, because then you get that pop of color. So a lot of the things that we find out at Dino and McConkey Springs will have like a nice patina on it, either a bright red natural surface or in some areas like a really dark black blue kind of surface. And so when you peck into that and you expose the sandstone underneath, it's a bright pale kind of tan, and it really looks very cool. Then you put some paint over that and it's pretty sweet rock art. So absolutely, we do find these things constrained in different areas. In the Uinta Basin, we tend to find a lot of it, not only because we have a lot of people that were out there on the landscape and a lot of opportunity to make it with all those folks, but it's a lot of exposed sandstone. It was, back in dinosaur times, a nice desert area with oases. So we do find a lot of dinosaur bones there out of Dinosaur, right? Because we had that nice sand that would desiccate and preserve dinosaur bones for so long. And so now what it's done is created excellent sandstone. And like Judson was saying, there's been downcutting, erosion, there's been uplifting from mountain building, and it's exposed what would be a flat lake bottom and lifted it up and made hundreds of feet tall canyon walls with that nice uniform sandstone that was all back, 60 million years ago, was all sand dunes. So we get that all across the northern Uinta Basin. So yeah, that's an excellent question. There's a lot of opportunity out there.
Any more questions?
You both used a picture of, it's in red, it's on a slope like this, looking up at it on Jones Creek. I don't know the name of the figurine there. You know?
Is it the Bighorn sheep?
Yeah.
With the cool yeah.
Most fantastic pictograph ever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really famous piece of rock art. I mean, you type in rock art and that image is one of the ones that comes up, and it's looks like a ram, looks like it's got a ram's body, but it's got crazy elk-like antlers, but it's a really stunning piece of rock art. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the rock art in that area is so cool that Polly Shaftsma's books about categorizing rock art across the Southwest and across Utah, she uses a lot of the rock art panels in this area to develop her typology for Uinta Fremont, because it is just so bright and so stylistically similar to other things in that area. And it's just really great specimens of rock art out there, and that's one of them. It's cool.
I have one more question if nobody else wants to go. I worked for a number of years at the southern end of the Fremont area, and what I noticed there, in several cases, there were expansive panels of rock art with the big anthropomorphs, and there's also expansive cultural midden underneath those. And they were situated on south-facing cliffs which to me suggests that these were winter occupations. And so I'm wondering if you've noticed anything like that, and if you have had any means of looking at seasonality of occupation.
So the short answer is no. The longer answer is that in Jones Hole, location is largely conditioned by geological exposures. So deluge shelter, for example, is east facing, and that's where a lot of the rock shelter is, and that's where there's this really deep 10,000-year-old deposit, right? Experience of being in the canyon is that you don't want to be on that side of the canyon in the early part of the day because it's just blazing hot. But by about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun will be over the ridge line, and with just cold air rising off of the water from Jones Creek, it's super, super comfortable in there. I suspect that, you know, there's probably enough fauna in the deluge shelter that we could actually do a seasonality study of when people were in there. But like I said, you don't want to be there in the wintertime because it gets super, super cold in there, and you would basically be stuck in there. And so I don't think that people were there, at least during the Fremont period in the summer, I think, or in the winter. I think it was largely summer camps that were basically just taking care of fields. Jones Hole or Cub Creek, those are, I would have no shadow of a doubt, those are probably year-round occupations. So, and multi-year.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, this concludes this session, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to our speakers.